The key was still warm from her hand. That was the thing I couldn't stop thinking about as I stood in the hallway of my brother's house, holding the small brass key I'd found tucked inside the lining of his jacket pocket. My brother Raymond had been missing for 19 days. The police had filed their report, done their knocking on doors, and quietly moved on to more urgent matters. And yet, here was this key, warm as though someone had just been holding it, sitting in a jacket that should have been cold for nearly 3 weeks. I turned it over in my palm. It was old, the kind you'd find on a chest of drawers in a farmhouse. Not the sort of thing a man carries without reason. Raymond wasn't the sentimental type. He didn't keep trinkets. He had a place for everything, and a reason for every single thing in its place. That was how he'd always been. Even when we were boys growing up outside of Christchurch, 2 years apart, and closer than most brothers I've known. So why did he have this key? I should explain something about myself before I go further. My name is Gordon Tate. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer in Wellington before taking early retirement and moving back to the South Island where Raymond and I had grown up. My wife Margaret passed away 4 years ago, breast cancer, swift and merciless, and since then it had been just the two of us, Raymond and me. He never married. He said he came close once, back in the 90s, but that was a story he only told when he'd had a couple of glasses of Hawke's Bay Red, and the evening had grown quiet enough for old things to surface. Raymond was 61. He ran a small architectural salvage business out of a converted shed on the edge of his property near Rangiora. Old doors, cowrie, floorboards, colonial ironwork, that sort of thing. Modest income, comfortable life. He knew everyone in town, and everyone knew him, which was exactly why his disappearance had made so little sense to anyone. He hadn't gone on a trip. He hadn't told his one part-time employee, a young woman named Petra, that he'd be away. He hadn't withdrawn unusual amounts of money. He'd simply stopped returning calls one Friday morning in late April, and by Sunday evening, I was driving up from Dunedin because something in my chest told me that this was not a man who had gone somewhere voluntarily. I found his back door unlocked, his coffee half-made, and his dog, an old heading dog named Biscuit, lying on the kitchen floor with the hollow, anxious look of an animal that had been waiting far too long for someone to come home. The police, as I said, had been through everything. They found no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, no indication of where Raymond had gone. His car was still in the driveway. His passport was in the kitchen drawer. His phone had last pinged a tower 2 kilometers from his property. What the police hadn't done was go through his jackets properly. I was doing that 19 days in because I needed something to do with my hands. Grief that hasn't yet confirmed itself as grief is a terrible thing. It sits in you like water that hasn't found its level yet. I was pulling his jackets from the wardrobe one by one, checking pockets the way I used to check my boys' school uniforms for forgotten notes. And that was when I found it. A small brass key, no label, no markings except for a single number stamped into the bow. 4. I stood there in Raymond's bedroom for a long time. Then I went looking. The shed was the obvious place to start. Raymond's salvage business meant the shed was enormous, a repurposed shearing shed, 40 meters long, packed with everything from Victorian skirting boards to cast iron bathtubs. I had been through it once already with the police. But that was a walkthrough. The kind where you're looking for a person, not a door. This time I was looking for a door that matched a key. It took me the better part of 2 hours. The shed was a labyrinth of stacked timber and hanging ironwork, and the light was poor even in the middle of the afternoon. I worked my way from the front to the back, trying the key in every lock I came across. Old padlocks, cabinet doors, a timber chest near the workbench. Nothing. I was nearly at the back wall when I noticed it. There was a section of the shed where the old cowrie boards had been stacked to ceiling height, forming what looked like a solid wall of timber. I had assumed it was just storage. Raymond stacked things everywhere. But when I pushed against one end of the stack, it didn't give the way a loose pile of boards would. It moved as a single unit, cleanly, on a pivot. Behind it was a door. A real door, solid Rimu, with an old brass lock plate set into the corrugated iron wall of the shed. The kind of door that had been there a long time and had been very deliberately hidden. My hand was shaking when I put the key in the lock. It turned on the first try. The room beyond was small, perhaps 3 meters by 4. There was a single fluorescent light on a pull cord, which I found by running my hand along the wall. When it clicked on, what I saw stopped every thought in my head. My brother was sitting on a camp stretcher in the far corner, wrapped in a sleeping bag, blinking against the sudden light with the dazed expression of a man who has been in the dark for a very long time. "Gordon," he said. That was all he said. Just my name, in the voice of a man who had stopped expecting to hear another voice say his. I crossed the room in 4 steps and had my arms around him before either of us could say anything else. He was thinner than he should have been. His face was rough with 3 weeks of beard. There was a small camp toilet behind a partition screen, a stack of tinned food on a shelf, baked beans, peaches, tuna, and a water container that was nearly empty. Someone had set this room up in advance. Someone had planned this. It took Raymond several minutes to be able to speak properly. I gave him water, and the only food I had with me, a muesli bar from my jacket pocket. I held his hands, and I waited. The relief of finding him alive was so enormous that it had temporarily replaced every other feeling. And I was grateful for that, because the other feelings were going to be very dark indeed when they arrived. He told me gradually. The story came out in pieces, the way stories do when a person has been alone with them for too long and doesn't know where to start. The short version was this. Raymond had a business partner I hadn't known about. That was the first thing. About 8 months earlier, he had entered into a private arrangement with a man named Douglas Henare, late 40s, property developer, based in Christchurch. The arrangement had seemed straightforward at the time. Douglas would provide capital and connections. Raymond would provide expertise and stock, and together they'd expand the salvage business into architectural consulting for heritage restoration projects. There was real money in that work. Wellington, Christchurch post-quake, Auckland's Villa Belt, the demand was there. Raymond had signed documents. He'd transferred the rights to his business name and his client contacts into a jointly held company structure that Douglas's solicitor had prepared. He told me he'd read the documents, but I know my brother, and I know that Raymond trusts people he likes, and Douglas was very likable. What Raymond hadn't realized, until about a month before his disappearance, was that the documents he'd signed hadn't created an equal partnership. They'd created a structure in which Douglas held 70% of the new entity, and buried in the fine print of a clause Raymond's reading glasses hadn't helped him parse. They gave Douglas the right to buy Raymond out entirely, for a nominal sum if Raymond was found to be in breach of a set of operational requirements that Douglas, as majority holder, had the sole discretion to define. In other words, Douglas could declare Raymond in breach whenever he chose, pay him next to nothing, and take the whole thing. By the time Raymond understood this, he'd already made the calls and sent the emails that would confirm Douglas's version of events. He'd gone to a solicitor, a different one this time, who had looked at the documents and told him the situation was, to use the legal phrase, not ideal. That was when Raymond had started asking questions, and that was when things had stopped being merely unfair and had become frightening. He'd found, through a contact who knew the Christchurch property scene, that Douglas Henare had done this before. Not once, not twice, at least 4 times in the past decade. Each time with a small business owner who had something Douglas wanted. Each time the pattern was the same. Partnership, paperwork, isolation, acquisition. One of the previous targets, a woman who'd run an antique tile business in Littleton, had ended up losing her home as well as her business. She'd tried to go to the police and been told it was a civil matter. Another man, a timber merchant from Rangiora. And here, Raymond paused and looked at me with something that wasn't quite surprise, had actually been Raymond's neighbor 3 years earlier, before he'd had to sell up and move away. Raymond hadn't connected the dots at the time. He hadn't known the timber merchant well enough to know the details of what had happened to him. But he knew now. The week before Raymond disappeared, he'd received a visit. Douglas had come to the shed alone on a Thursday afternoon and had explained to Raymond in the careful, pleasant tone of a man who is accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room that it would be in everyone's best interests if Raymond signed the buyout papers voluntarily. He had named a figure that was insultingly small. He had also, without raising his voice or making any direct threat, mentioned that he had friends in several places where Raymond might find himself needing someone not to be a friend, the local council, a couple of the banks, a man who sat on the board of the Heritage Trust that provided much of the consulting work Raymond had been hoping to access. Raymond had told him to leave. 2 days later, a Saturday, when Petra wasn't at work, Raymond had come out to the shed in the morning and found the false wall of cowrie boards had been interfered with. The pivot mechanism, which he'd built himself years ago to store his most valuable stock securely, had been tampered with. Raymond had understood then that Douglas knew about the room and that this was a message. He'd panicked. I'll say that plainly because Raymond would say it himself, he'd panicked. And he'd made a decision that he acknowledged was not his finest. Instead of calling me, instead of calling the police, he had gone back into that room and locked himself in, taking enough supplies to last a few weeks while he tried to think his way through it. His reasoning, and it was not entirely without logic, even if it was also fear, was that if he disappeared voluntarily before Douglas could make his move, Douglas would have no leverage. You cannot pressure a man who is not there to be pressured. You cannot buy out a partner who has made himself unreachable. Raymond had thought that from a position of invisibility he could engage a solicitor remotely, gather evidence, and find a way to expose what Douglas had been doing to him and to the others before him. What he had not accounted for was that the mobile phone signal inside a corrugated iron shed built against a concrete pad is essentially non-existent. His phone had died on day 3. After that, he was just a man in a room with tinned food and a sleeping bag, and nothing but his own thoughts for company. I sat in that room with my brother for a long time after he finished talking. Then I asked him one question. Do you have the documents? The originals? He pointed to the shelf above the tinned food. Behind a stack of salvage catalogs, there was a manila folder, thick with papers. I kept copies of everything, he said. From the beginning. I just didn't know what I was looking at until it was too late. I picked up the folder. I looked at my brother gaunt, exhausted, relieved in the way that only people who have genuinely believed they might not see another familiar face can be relieved, and I said, "Right, let's get you home. I want to be honest about what happened over the following weeks because it matters for the people who might one day find themselves in a version of this situation." The first thing I did after getting Raymond into his house, fed, and into a hot shower was call the police. Not the local station. I called a detective I'd been put in touch with through a former colleague, a man who dealt specifically with financial fraud and coercion. I told him the story in full. I told him about the documents. I told him about the others, the tile businesswoman in Littleton, the timber merchant who'd been Raymond's neighbor. He listened without interrupting. And when I finished, he said, "Mr. Tate, this is the 4th call I've had in 2 years that mentions Douglas Henare." They had been building a file. They had just, as he put it, been waiting for someone willing to stand up and be counted. Raymond was willing. He was frightened, still, but he was willing. The solicitor who took Raymond's civil case was a woman from Christchurch, sharp, experienced, and disinclined to be impressed by clever document structures. She looked at the papers in the manila folder and identified 3 separate clauses that she believed were unconscionable under New Zealand contract law, and one that she thought was straightforwardly fraudulent. She filed immediately. The Commerce Commission became involved. So did, eventually, the Serious Fraud Office. Douglas Henare, it turned out, had been extraordinarily careful for a very long time. But the mistake people like Douglas make, and I have thought about this a great deal since, is that they plan for their victims to be isolated, and they never plan for the victims to have someone who comes looking. Raymond had me. I had come looking. The tile businesswoman's name was Carolyn Marsh. I found her through the solicitor, who had found her through the Littleton Business Registry. She was 54 years old, running a small coastal accommodation business. And when I called her, she cried on the phone for about 90 seconds before pulling herself together and saying, "Tell me what you need from me." The timber merchant's name was Phil Burrows. He'd moved to the West Coast and was working for a sawmill. He had kept every document, every email, every text message. He had never thrown a single thing away because he had always believed that one day someone would ask. That day had come. By the time the case was heard, and I will spare you the particular exhaustion of watching the legal system move at its own pace, which is considerable, Douglas Henare was facing charges that went well beyond what had been done to Raymond. Carolyn Marsh's loss was quantified and put before the court. Phil Burrows' testimony was devastating in its detail and its calm. Raymond's folder of documents was, as the Crown's barrister described it to me in the corridor outside the courtroom, a gift. Douglas received a sentence that I will not pretend was as long as I would have liked. But it was real, and it was on the record, and the company structure he had built so carefully was unwound completely by the civil proceedings. Raymond received a settlement, not everything he'd lost, because that is rarely how it works, but enough to rebuild. The salvage business is still going. Petra, who had spent 3 weeks convinced she was about to lose her job, turned out to be as loyal as anyone I have known. She now has a proper contract and a small stake in the business, which was Raymond's idea, and which I think says something important about who my brother is. Raymond is 61 years old. He is not the same man he was before all of this, but he is not a lesser version of himself either. He is more watchful. He is less inclined to assume that a person who seems trustworthy is trustworthy. He calls me more often than he used to. I do not consider that a loss. I still have the small brass key. It sits in a dish on my kitchen windowsill in Dunedin. I look at it sometimes in the morning when the light is coming in over the harbor, and I think about the fact that the difference between Raymond coming home and Raymond not coming home was me putting my hands into a jacket pocket on a Tuesday afternoon, 19 days into a disappearance that most people had quietly stopped believing would resolve itself. I think about Carolyn Marsh, who had no one come looking. I think about Phil Burrows, keeping his folder of documents for years in the hope that something would happen and someone would ask. I think about the fact that the people who do what Douglas Henare did, and there are more of them than any of us would like to believe, in this country and everywhere else, they depend on silence. They depend on shame, on isolation, on the particular despair that comes over a person when they look at a document they've signed and realize they cannot afford to tell anyone how foolish they've been. The thing is, Raymond wasn't foolish. He was trusting. Those are not the same thing, though it can take a very long time and a great deal of pain to understand the difference. If you are reading this, and you are in a version of what Raymond was in, if someone has used your trust as a mechanism against you, if the paperwork has started to look like a trap, if the person who seemed like a partner has started to feel like a threat, please, hear me when I say this. The worst thing you can do is go into a room and lock the door. The shame belongs to the person who deceived you, not to you. Tell someone. Show someone the documents. Find the others, because there are almost always others. and they have been waiting, as Phil Burrows waited, for someone to ask. In this country, we have a tendency to want to sort things out ourselves, to not make a fuss, to absorb what's been done to us quietly and move on. That quality has its virtues in some parts of life. In this situation, it is exactly what predatory people are counting on. My brother is alive because I went looking. He is free because 3 people were willing to stand up together and be counted. Douglas Henare will spend years carrying what he did on his record because enough people refuse to be ashamed of being deceived. That is how it should work. That is the only way it does work. Raymond and I had dinner together last Sunday. He made a lamb roast. He's always been a better cook than me. And we sat at his kitchen table with Biscuit asleep under the chair. And we talked until it was late. Not about the case. Not about Douglas. Not about any of it. We talked about the summers we'd spent as boys at our grandparents' place near Kaikoura. We talked about Margaret, my wife. We talked about what Raymond might do with the business. If he ever decides to wind it down, maybe train someone to take it over, keep the thing going, not let all that knowledge about old timber and colonial ironwork just disappear with him. Normal things. Ordinary things. I drove back to Dunedin in the dark with the heater going, and somewhere on the road south of Waimate, with the stars showing bright over the Mackenzie country, I thought, this is what we were fighting for. Not the settlement, not the court record, not even the principle of the thing, though all of that mattered. We were fighting for Sunday dinners, for an old dog under the table, for the right to sit with someone who has known you all your life and talk about nothing in particular until it is late and time to go home. That is worth every bit of the fight. Don't ever let anyone convince you it isn't.